everyone. Welcome back to the continued hearing for House Bill 1650. I know. If you want to speak, I need to have a pink card filled out or a new pink card filled out, because right now I have none. So if I don't have any pink cards, I'm going to close the hearing because we have nothing further to discuss. So, okay. I know that the director has left a letter because he couldn't make it today. Did she just say no, she can't be here.
Can I approach?
Yes, please. Please do. She can make me feel like a judge. I love it. It's got to be the gavel, right? Okay, so the first person to speak is Keith Keeney from Child and Family Services to speak in opposition to the bill, and he's asked for 5 to 8 minutes, I guess.
Terrible handwriting, and when I rushed it really does sound. So, good morning, members of the committee. My name is Keith Kinney. I'm the Advocacy Director at Child and Family Services. I'm here to speak in opposition to the bill. I have to be completely honest with you. I don't have my notes. I forgot that this was happening this morning. I'm trying to do my best in my recollection remember from previous testimony. There were just a couple of items that I wanted to bring up here. One, I know that in the previous testimony there was some discussion about how there's been an increase in the number of cases that have been brought forward for educational abuse and neglect. DCYF is seeing an increase overall. I was looking at the numbers. It's not surprising to me that you would have more cases of abuse or educational neglect. DCYF is seeing over a 3-month period, their calls into DCYF increase over one period from 3,000 to about 5,000 calls. So that there would be more calls on educational neglect doesn't surprise me. Statistically, it would probably increase about the same at that amount. The other numbers that were thrown around for a little while were that it made it look like it was such a small percentage of cases that we're seeing that were educational neglect from the number of calls that were made into DCYF. But I did the numbers, and it's about 5%, which is about where we are on founded cases in general. So I'm just trying to let the committee know that the educational neglect cases that are coming forward are not so far outside the realm in an increase in the number, nor in the number that are identified as founded as most of the other cases across the board. I guess I would just like to say, in this day and age, with the need for people to have and kids to have a higher education, I just can't imagine that we would get rid of educational neglect. We could have a family that just decides that it's not important for a child to have any education, and I can't imagine a 16 or 17-year-old reaching a point where they couldn't read, they couldn't write, and being able to try to make their way in this society. I guess, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have food and shelter, but in this day and age, education has got to be right there as much as with food and shelter as far as what a child needs to succeed in our society. So I guess in summation, statistically the numbers are not that far off from other abuse and neglect cases, and it just strikes me that for us to walk away from kids, we have to make sure that children have an education in this day and age in New Hampshire, across our country. And to take that power away from DCYF, which in my opinion is not being abused, would really put a lot of kids at risk. And that's my testimony, so I'm happy to take any questions.
So can you tell me, if we were to take this away from DCYF, do you have any idea what the procedure would be for if there is a case of abuse of educational neglect? How would that be handled? Say, because I will tell you that in the previous hearing, they were claiming that homeschoolers were being targeted. But let's face it, someone can say that they're homeschooling and they're not.
Right.
So how would it be handled if this wasn't under the purview of DCYF? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I don't know who else would have that power, quite honestly. I mean, I think it goes to exactly what my fear would be also. In this day and age of the opiate abuse, you could have, I mean, we had 2 children that were spending the day, one had been expelled, and he sat in our street outreach facility down in Manchester all day long without any education, mom and dad. Now, if the mom and dad are claiming that that child is being homeschooled, and that child is not getting any schooling whatsoever, if you take this power away from DCYF, I'm not sure who's there to make sure that the child gets some education. So, and as I said again, I think from looking at the numbers, I know they look high for the number of calls that are made in about educational neglect and the number that are founded, but that's pretty much close to where we are in this state. I mean, we have about 12,000 phone calls, this is for previous years, 12,000 phone calls that come in of some type of abuse and neglect, and only about 856 founded cases, so we're right around like 5.6%, which is right about where the educational neglect was also. So I guess the thing that concerned me from the previous testimony was that there seemed to be basically a storyline that somehow homeschoolers are being targeted in some kind of way, and I just don't think the numbers back that up from what I can see compared to the general numbers that come in from DCYF versus the neglect for education.
So let me ask you another question. You were stating how a child had been expelled. I mean, you can't really, how would you make that educational neglect on the parents of the child? Because quite frankly, I don't think we're expelling enough of these kids that are threatening schools and stuff. I mean, we have to put other kids' safety, you know, ahead of you know, the ones that are making the threats. How does that become educational neglect on the parents if the child's been expelled?
Thank you for the question. I don't think it does. I guess I was trying to use it as an example with the number. We are seeing more and more parents that both the mom and the dad are addicted to opiates, to the point where there are actually plans that the plan to deal with the family without taking the kids away is to say to mom, you get high on Monday, dad, you get high on Tuesday, mom, you get high on Wednesday. I can see your eyes are opening up, but that actually does happen. And I guess my fear is that if you have so little concern, or you're so addicted that you can't make those judgments, you could just very easily say, my kids aren't going to school because I'm homeschooling them, and these parents do not have the ability probably at that point to be able to homeschool or make those choices. So it seems to me at some point, someone, and it needs to be DCYF, needs to walk in and say, you say you're schooling these children at home, but you're not, and we need to protect this child, because a child needs an education to function in our society in this day and age. So I'm not saying an expelled student is necessarily abuse and neglect. I didn't mean to, and I apologize if that's the conclusion you came to from my testimony. I'm just saying we're seeing more and more parents that could use homeschooling as an excuse to not have to meet any kind of qualifications of getting their child an education. And that's where my fear is, especially with this opiate crisis. And this is one of the reasons I opposed the bill.
Representative Lewicki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. My concern is that we, having DCYF and the truancy system and the education system is essentially a duplication of services. And with this, because do these homeschoolers not have to report to the school district? Does the school district not take any responsibility?
Thank you for the question. I don't know the layers. I can honestly say I don't know the layers. I don't know how much the truancy are able to force these kids back in. I do know that this gives the power to DCYF to say, look, there's educational neglect going on here, and this has to be rectified in some kind of way. So as far as what layer is more powerful than the other, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm sorry. But I do know that DCYF does have the ability to file educational neglect charges in order to get the child back to the education that they need. I could, Representative, I could find that out for you and get back to you with
And
that.
I will let you know that Byron Kennedy's going to be here at exec session. He couldn't be here right now, so if we have any questions, we can ask him during our exec session if there's anything you need to ask him.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Representative Gay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. When the DCYF identifies a child that they think is suffering from educational neglect, to whom do you report it?
That DCYF, well, I think DCYF makes the finding of educational neglect, and then they begin the process of rectifying that with the parents. So
They just deal with, excuse me,
no, go ahead.
so they just deal with the parents, that's who they talk to, if they recognize a problem.
Yeah, we're not having a discussion back and forth. You can ask a question, but we're not gonna have dialogue, like a discussion.
I feel like, I apologize, Madam Chair, I
That's
feel like
okay.
I cut the representative off. Do you mind repeating, would it be all right if she repeated the question, Madam Chair?
Please.
Okay, when I asked who you report it to, it sounds like your answer is you don't report it, you deal with the parents.
Thank you for the question. That would be my understanding, just like you would in any abuse and neglect case. DCYF would have a finding of educational neglect, and then they would begin the process of dealing with the issue. I'm sure at that point they would start working with the school, trying to get the child back in, making sure the parents understand that the child has to be there, or if there's homeschooling going on, there's actually correct homeschooling going on. I mean, I would assume that DCYF has the power that if educational neglect continues, they could actually remove the child from the home, just as in they could in any other abuse and neglect case, and say, because the neglect is happening, we're able to remove the child and put them in foster care, someplace that they could actually get their education. So how they work among what they're able to share, I think the chair said that Attorney Kennedy will be here. He'd be more qualified to answer that. I just know that once it rises to the same level as neglect as any other neglect, DCYF would go through its normal process of trying to rectify the problem and then possibly removing the child if the neglect isn't somehow rectified by the parents.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next is Louise Spencer to speak in opposition to the bill, and she's asked for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my name is Louise Spencer, and I'm from Concord, New Hampshire. I hadn't planned to speak this morning, but I just find it so clear that education is a basic need in this society. For any child to emerge from their childhood without an education, they're completely unprepared to go into the world, and they won't be able to get a job, they won't be able to fend for themselves, they won't be able to, they just simply won't be able to make it in the world. And so to me, it seems that we need to, as a society, be ensuring that every child has access to the basic skills that they need to go forward. And if a parent is failing to provide that because of something like an addiction to opiates or some other, it can be a variety of things, then that parent has to be held accountable, and that child needs to be, so that's the point at which we need to step in and say that child has the rights to this education. This is not about homeschooling in any way. If the parent's homeschooling, they're taking an interest in their child's education, they're helping that child prepare for the future. But the parent who is totally neglecting a child's education is, by definition, engaging in parental neglect. So anyway, thank you for listening to my thoughts on it. And are there any questions?
Representative Varian?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. Do you have a sense that DCYF is in a better position to address these issues than a truancy officer who is employed by the school district?
I have to say I'm not familiar with the different layers of protection. I do know that there needs to be an agency that can really enforce consequences and ensure that that the child ultimately gets the education that they need. So it can't be just a series of fines or something where a parent can, take those and still continue the behavior. There has to be some agency that can step in and say, you are not educating your child, this is neglect, this has to change, and that they have the authority and the power to make that change. I personally had a daughter who was out of school for a year due to a medical crisis, and so I at times had to obviously interface with the school and the truancy officers and provide evidence that I was giving my child an education to the extent that she was able to have an that her medical condition allowed her to participate in education. So, I've had some personal familiarity in that regard, but I don't think it's enough to just have a system that is looking and saying, oh, this is happening, and let's bring the parent into court and maybe give them a fine, and because the child will continue to suffer. So there has to be an agency, and if that's DCYF, then I would support that being the agency to do that, that can come in and do a finding of neglect and make sure that the situation changes. The other thing that I can speak to is that my daughter, when a child loses a year of education, that has a significant impact on their ability to then re-engage with education. And so, this isn't something that is benign and that can be allowed to continue. It becomes an emergency. Children lose, particularly younger children, if they're not learning to read. There are studies that show by third grade, you never really catch up with your word bank. You never develop the fluency and the literacy that you need in order to be successful. And there are studies out of Yale University that talk very, very succinctly to that point. I have another daughter who has dyslexia, so I'm very familiar with those studies, that if children are not getting education, they fall behind and they're never really able to catch up. So when I am looking at this bill, I see